Okay, so we're going to cover section 7 today. There's only one more lesson in the chapter, and we will cover that on Thursday. Again, your test on chapter 5 is a week from today. It'll be next Tuesday. So let's go ahead and see what we're going to be doing here. So in this lesson, what we're going to be doing is after we prove two triangles are congruent, then we're going to go back and any side or any angle that does not have a congruency mark, we're going to be able to prove those two angles or the sides congruent by using this acronym here, CPCTC. And what that stands for is corresponding parts. So the C in this acronym, this first C, comes from corresponding. Then the P in the acronym comes from parts. And then the congruent, this comes from, for this C. And then triangles, this is the T. And then congruent is this last C. So every other letter in the acronym is the letter C. So CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So what's going to happen is, let me go ahead and draw two triangles here for you. So let's say I draw my first triangle, and we're going to label this one as ABC. And then I'm going to draw another one, and these are congruent triangles, even though they might not look perfect, but we're going to show that they're congruent. D, E, F, that's what we'll call this one. And let's say you were given that angle C is congruent to F, and that AC is congruent to DF, and that angle A is congruent to angle D. Because I have three congruencies here, I can say that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, and my reason would be angle side angle, because notice you have an angle, a side, it's the included side, and then another angle that's marked as congruent. Now, this is what our goal is going to be in this lesson, is to first show that the two given triangles are congruent. Then from this point on, you're going to be either asked to show that angle B is congruent to angle E, or you might be asked to prove that segment AB is congruent to DE, or the last side that doesn't have a marking, BC, is congruent to EF. Notice all these three things that I just wrote in red, they are not marked as congruent on my triangle. But if you refer back to when we first started learning about congruent figures, at the beginning, there was only one way to show that something was congruent, and that was to show that every single corresponding part had a match that it was congruent to. So now we've learned 5 shortcuts, and as soon as you can show that your two triangles are congruent by using one of the shortcuts, then you can go back and you could say, well, since I already know that these two triangles are exactly the same, I can go back now and say that angle B is congruent to angle E, and that reason is CPCTC, because all corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So you'll be given a statement. Maybe you would give everything marked as congruent, but then they'll say, prove this. Prove that B is congruent to E. Or they might say, prove that these two sides that don't have markings are congruent. All three use the same reason, CPCTC. You cannot use this reason until after you've proven the triangles congruent by one of the shortcuts. This will always follow either hypotenuse leg, side, 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 side angle side, angle, side, angle, or angle, angle, side. It will always follow one of those. So let's try 3 proofs. And that's pretty much, you only have 6 problems for homework. Now the homework doesn't say to write proofs, it just says make a plan for a proof. My advice to you is, I would solve them as if they were proofs, just so you can practice. So let's try this first example. Let me go ahead and get my statement column and my reason column set up. Now I'm going to go ahead and write in my given, and then I'm also going to label it in my picture. So PR bisects angle QPS. And I'm also given that PQ is congruent to PS. Let me go ahead and add those markings in here. Remember, an angle bisector is going to make 2 congruent angles. So QPS, and it splits it into 2 equal parts. Now, I can't get away with just marking it on the picture. I now have to go back and state what that just did in my proof. So I'm going to state that angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR. And the reason why I can say this is by definition of an angle bisector. Now, I only have 2 pieces on here. I need to now look at my picture and figure out what else can I say here is congruent. And I can realize that I've got this shared side, and I can say that side PR is congruent to side PR by the reflexive property. Because the 2 triangles I'm about to prove congruent is this one and this one. And notice this side here in the middle is the same for both. So that's why I stated in there that it's the same angle, it's congruent to itself, and I use the reflexive property. Now I have enough information in my picture, and I'm going to be using side, angle, side to show that these 2 triangles are congruent. So triangle QPR is congruent to triangle SPR, and that reason is side, angle, side. Now, if you recall back from the beginning, it didn't want me to prove the triangles congruent. It wanted me to show that these 2 angles were congruent. So now that I've proven that the blue and the green are congruent, now I can go back and say angle Q is congruent to angle S because of the CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now if I needed to, I could go back. I'm going to add those in. And then I could also say that this angle is congruent and this side is congruent to this one. I can go back and put congruency marks on every single piece of the 2 triangles because I've already shown that they're congruent by the side, angle, side. Or this same picture. So let's go ahead and get our proof ready to go. Make your statement column and your reason column. Let's list all this given. So PR, this time it's bisecting both sides. So it's bisecting both QPS and QRS. So both sides. And that's given. So this tells me this is congruent here, and then this to this. I need to state what I just added to the picture. I can't just add it to the picture. So again, I can state that angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR, and the other one that was bisected, the QRP, and is congruent to the SRP. And this reason is definition of an angle bisector. Now, I only have 2 markings. I need to look at my picture now and figure out, do I have vertical angles here? And again, notice they're touching, so it's going to be the reflexive side. So I can say that PR equals PR, or is congruent to PR. And again, reflexive property. And now I have enough information. I've got an angle, a side, and an angle. So for number 4, triangle QRP is congruent to triangle SRP, and that reason is angle side angle. Now again, let's go back. Remember, we're trying to prove that RQ is congruent to RS. And now that I've proven these 2 triangles are exactly the same, I can go back and say that RQ is congruent to RS, and that reason is that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And the same thing, the proof could have also been show that angle Q is congruent to angle S, or that side PQ was congruent to PS. Any of those things could have been what you were trying to prove. All right, last example. Again, still a proof. So let's go ahead and set up your statement column and your reason column. Number 1, let's get all the given in here. WX is congruent to YZ, and ZW is congruent to XY. And that is given. Let me go ahead and add the congruency marks to my picture. So WX is congruent to YZ, and this one over here. So again, when you're doing the shortcuts, usually you need 3 things. So the last thing, again, here's this obvious side, and I can say that ZX, or you could say XZ, is congruent to itself. It's that shared side, and that's reflexive. Notice I now have all 3 sides marked, so side, side, side. So I can state that triangle XWZ is congruent to triangle ZYX, and that reason is side, side, side. And now I'll go back. Someone asked about the way I figured out the angle side angle. I'll go back and look at that again. But let's finish this one. So again, now that I've established that these 2 triangles are congruent, now I can go back and add in congruency marks to all the other pieces within the triangle. All the other corresponding parts are also congruent. So corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So 1 would be congruent to 2. I could also show, if they said prove instead, angle 3 congruent to angle 4. Instead of this being the last statement, it would be 3 congruent to 4, but the same reason. Or if it said W to Y, same thing. Those are the remaining pieces that did not have markings, but as soon as you've established that the 2 triangles are congruent, then you can go back and put markings on everything. But generally, when they ask you to write a proof using CPCTC, it's only one other additional piece. So that is it for the 5-7 notes. Now someone asked me to go back. I'll go back. Yes.
For the third
Here. Remember, whenever you're using this as your last statement, the step right above it would have needed to be how you prove the triangle's congruent. You cannot use CPCTC until after the triangles have been shown to be congruent. So that always follows that. Let's say I wanted to try to use side angle side here. I would have probably needed to be given that these lines were parallel, and then I could have drawn a transversal, and then I could have also gone and found 1 to be congruent to 2 by alternate interior. So it's all going to depend on your given and which shortcut you're going to use. When we take the test next week, you're not going to be given, and they're not going to tell you, hey, you need to show that these triangles are congruent using side, side, side. What's